This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
A present active indicative, third person singular, luamen. Present active indicative, first person plural. Hi, how are you doing today? It's good to have you back. I was just working on parsing some Greek verbs, something that you'll be learning to do very soon, and in fact something we're going to talk a little bit about today. The main portion of our lesson today is going to do with the present and future active indicative. By this time you should have read chapter 3 and gone over that material to get it in your mind, and today we're going to cover that. We're going to also talk about vocabulary and talk a little bit about some of the aspects of the Greek verb system relative to the present active indicative. So stay with us, and I hope you enjoy today's lesson. I hope you have something to write with, and I hope you've been working on your vocabulary cards and doing all that you need to do to bring you up to this point in learning to use the Greek New Testament. Let's talk about what it means to parse. We're going to spend some time now talking about parsing. And let's define it. And on page 21 of your textbook, David Black gives you a sort of definition relative to that. And basically what it entails is this. Parsing is just breaking down the verb, giving or identifying all of its elements, all of the elements that are involved in the verb, so that we can know exactly what that verb, how that verb is behaving or acting, as it were, in the sentence. Is it active? What tense is it in? What voice does it have? And so what I want to do now is to show you a little bit about how to do that. Now, I realize that we haven't talked about a number of these tenses in detail, but I just want to give you an idea of what's involved in parsing, and then in just a moment we'll go to a chart that will give us the order that you'll want to use when you parse. So parsing is nothing more than this. It's just identifying the basic elements of a particular verb. So let's go to the board now and take a look at some of the words here. Notice that we have our word luo here that we have been working with, and if you read your chapter you'll be familiar with maybe some of these endings, and we'll talk about these in more detail as the lesson goes on today, but I wanted you to just have a feel for what we mean. Well, notice that these endings here are going to tell us, eis, a, amen, and ete, are going to tell me that, because I've memorized them, because I know from reading Greek grammar books that indeed when people use these charts, when they use this information over and over again, they've learned what patterns develop, and they learn what endings go with a particular tense. And so you'll be learning those, and you'll just know, okay, when I see that ending, that's present tense, or that's future, or that's imperfect or perfect. One of the several tenses that we've talked about. So if we look at this particular word here, lues, to parse that is basically to tell people that it's present tense, that it's active voice, indicative mood, that it's the second person plural. And that this one, for example, is present active indicative as well, but this ending right here, this epsilon iota ending, is the third person singular. And we mentioned something about that in the last lesson. Well, this one, luamen, is present active indicative, first person plural. And then this one is luete, present active indicative, second person plural. And again, all of these verbs right here, all of these verb forms are in the present active indicative. In other words, the action of that verb is taking place at the present time in the sense of how it's being spoken of. And so it literally means here, eis is your second person, you loose, or you are loosing. That's how it's being read, for example, in the Bible. If you read that in the Bible, you would read it as, you are loosing. Not you loosed, not you shall loose, but you are loosing. And to indicate again that it's being spoken of in a present time sense. Now, the same thing here, lue. Oes a, he, she, or it looses, or is loosing. So these are all present, active, indicative. And the active part of that we mentioned in the last lesson has reference to the subject of the sentence performing the action of this verb. So whoever is the subject of the sentence For example, if it were Jesus if this were used in a sentence with regard to Jesus, Jesus would be doing the loosing, and he'd be doing it in the present tense in the sense of how it's being read in the Bible. So Jesus looses the slave, for example. Now, again, all of this may be new to some of you, and just stay with us, because as we go through these things together, they'll become clearer and clearer. And as you become used to hearing these terms, I think it'll make more sense, especially when we get to working through an actual sentence that we'll be doing in the lessons ahead. All right, these are all present active indicative verbs with different endings, and so our person and our number is a little bit different. But that's, in effect, what parsing is all about. Parsing also, if we look over here, would include dealing with other tenses. Now, luo, I know it's present tense because that's omega is a present tense ending. It's active voice because that's what ending is used in the active voice for the first person. Now, I didn't list the persons over here because every one of these are first person. They're first person singular endings. And so what ends up happening, notice though the stem is the same every time, lu, 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 lu. All right, and there's our stem there. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to underline those so that you can readily see them. There's lu, 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 and then you come over here, and then there it is right there, and there it is right there. And what ends up happening is that when these verbs go to different tenses, when we go to different voices, then their endings are going to change. Notice the endings are going to change, so that I have an ending here, I have an ending there, I have this ending there, and I have this ending is all one ending there, and that's all one ending, and that's all one ending. And each of those particular verb endings tell me basically what tense that verb is in. All right, so maybe that's making a little bit more sense to you now, so that as I look at lu-o, that O ending is telling me it's present active indicative. I loose is how that would be translated. Or I am loosing is perhaps even the more accurate way of saying that I am loosing. And then this one, lu-o-mai. Lu-o-mai. O-mai is an ending for the passive voice. For the passive voice. Remember, voice says, tells us who is performing the action of the verb or who it's being performed upon. And in this particular instance, since it's passive, the action of this verb is being performed back upon the subject of the sentence. So if it were a slave, or ha doulos, it would be the slave is being loosed. The slave is being loosed. The action of this is coming back upon the subject. That o-my ending tells me it's passive voice. All right, this also happens to be, by the way, for those of you that have watched this maybe several times or have read your book, this also happens to be the middle ending as well, and we'll make those differentiations as time goes by. Talk about the difference between the passive and the middle. All right, notice the ending here, lu-so, lu-so. Now this sigma is something we'll talk about today, is a big indicator to allow us to know that this verb should be translated as future tense. And so is our ending. See, the omega is active voice, but this so tells us it's future. So luso. And that would be translated as I will loose, or I shall be loosing. Okay? Then notice, we're still in our future with this sigma sound, so my, luso my. Now my, again, in those primary tenses, has reference to the passive. See it here and here? But now it's future, so lusoamai. So this is a future passive indicative verb, and again, these are all first person singular. So present active indicative, first person singular verbs, and this one happens to be future passive indicative, first person singular. Now, take a look at this one. When we go to the past tense, look at what happens. An epsilon gets prefixed onto this stem. That's telling me right there, I am a past tense verb. I am a past tense verb. All right, when it's prefixed onto this stem. You might ask, well, is there ever a time when an epsilon will begin a word and when it's not past tense? Yes. That's why you have to know your vocabulary, because your vocabulary will remind you that luo doesn't have an epsilon on it in its lexical form. It only has an epsilon on it if it's being spoken of in the past tense. So this happens to be an imperfect active indicative first person singular verb. The imperfect has reference to an action that took place in the past, but its action is ongoing. The writer wanted you to, he was trying to stress to you and to me that the element of that verb is ongoing. So this was basically an imperfect active indicative first person singular verb as we parsed it, and I would know then that this should be translated as I was loosing. I was loosing. Okay? Then the last one here, if we parse this one, that little time morph that I call it, morpheme, remember that term from the earlier lessons, morpheme, it's a unit of meaning. All right, that's telling me again it's past tense, but now I have a different ending that says saw is just simply aorist. It's simply aorist, and that's undefined. It's still active indicative because I know that I just have to memorize saw, sin, saman, sati, san are all active, aorist active indicative endings, but I'm going to translate this one then as I loosed. Just simply I loosed. I loosed. But the one before that is I was loosing. I was loosing, and then this one is I loosed. I loosed. So when we parse a verb, what we're doing is nothing more than identifying its elements. Now when you're reading through the Greek New Testament and coming across these words, you don't always have to in your mind say, oh, that's present active indicative first person singular, or that's future present, or that's future middle voice, third person plural, and all that. After a while, it just sort of becomes a part of you. You don't do that in your own language. You don't think, okay, I need to talk to my friend Rudy here and say, let's see, I first person, and I'm going to talk to you, Rudy, and I say, Rudy, go do this, and that's in the third person, and you don't do that. It's just a part of you, and that's what happens. The more you work with Greek, the more you'll understand that when you see that O, you'll just say, oh, that means I loose, I loose. But when we talk about it among ourselves, and particularly as we analyze these words in reference to our sermon preparation and Bible class, and as we look into the Greek New Testament to help ourselves grow, then we'll want to be familiar with some of these terms to really glean perhaps some of the greater color of the New Testament that we talked about in earlier lessons in here. So, all right, so that's what's involved in parsing. Now, before we leave the topic of parsing, what I want to do is talk to you about the parsing order, all right? What's the order that we're going to go in when we list these things? Well, there are some disagreements about this, about what's the appropriate order, but this is the usual or the normal order that you'll see. The parsing order should be tense, all right, and that may be, again, present tense, imperfect, it may be future, it may be the aorist tense, it may be pluperfect. Those are your choices, but you're going to list whatever tense it is first. Then you're going to list voice. Voice, and remember the choices of voice are active, middle, and passive. And then you'll identify the mood. Identify the mood. And the mood will either be indicative, it'll be imperative, or it'll be subjunctive, or it'll be infinitive. And again, we described that in the previous lesson. All right, you'll identify the person, and you'll only have three choices in regard to person. It'll either be first, second, or third person. And then the number will either be singular or plural. And then sometimes, usually we'll say, of what particular verb. And we'll mention the lexical stem. Now, let's go back to the board, and I want to show you one more thing about the lexical stem. Now, if you take a look at this, when you identify and when you parse your verb, you say present active indicative, second person plural, then you would say of the verb or of le. Le would be your stem. And that's the way you're going to find that verb in your dictionary with that stem along with, let me just write it here on the board, along with the present active indicative first person singular ending. Okay? So what I want you to understand is this. When you look up a word in a Greek lexicon, not an analytical lexicon, but just a regular lexicon, you'll find the word in the present active indicative first person singular form of verbs. You won't find it in the very beginning of the entry looking like this or looking like that. This is the way you're going to find it. This is what's called its lexical form, the lexical form. And some of that will become, I think, a little clearer to you, especially near the end of the series of lessons when we talk about the use of lexical aids and how to look up these words and to be able to find them in a dictionary. And I'm real excited about you learning about that because I think it's going to be very, very helpful. So when we speak about the lexical form or its stem, this was what we mean. This is the stem, lu is the stem of this word, lues, lues. Okay, well, that's the information that we have on parsing. Now let's turn our attention to vocabulary, the vocabulary of Chapter 3. If you have a textbook, you need to go ahead and get that textbook out at this point and turn over to page 21 in the textbook and to find that vocabulary section. And we're going to cover these words, and you need to make flashcards for these as well so that you can be working on those outside of our class time here. There's something that you may be wondering about, and that is, why are we talking about vocabulary at the end of the chapter before we really talk about Chapter 3? The reason I like to do that is because oftentimes I have found that authors who put their vocabulary list at the end of the chapter end up talking about some of those words in their chapter. And so if we can spend a little time on the vocabulary ahead of time, then when we run across those words within the context of the chapter, then we've already got them committed to memory, or we've already noticed them or have become acquainted with them, so it becomes a little easier then when we read through that particular chapter. So that's why I've chosen to do it in just this fashion. So go ahead, get your book ready. What we're going to do in just a moment is flash up the first word up on the screen. And as you see that first word, underneath that word will also be a word very similar to it. The first word is the present active indicative, first person singular, the lexical form of the verb that we'll be learning. And then the word underneath it will be the word in its future tense. And one of the things you're going to notice about the future tense is that it has a very distinctive S sound, or a S sound to it. And that's one of the indicators for helping you to identify the future tense. We'll talk about some of the rules a little later on in class as to why sometimes it's a sigma and other times it's the letter psi. Why is that the case? Well, don't worry about that right now, but right now just hear that S sound in the second word, and we'll then translate it as a future tense verb. So what I'll do is I'll pronounce the word. I want you to say it out loud, and then I'll define the word, and from time to time I may speak about a word depending upon what information we may have about it that might sort of help to embed that word in our mind. So let's take a look at the first word now. The first word is the word ago. Ago, or I lead. Now look at the word underneath it, is its future form, oxo. Oxo, that letter xi still gives us the S sound, and so oxo is I will lead. I will lead. All right, let's take a look at the next word. Akuo. Akuo. Akuo means I hear. In fact, the English word acoustics comes from that word. Acoustics, to hear something. Notice the future form now is akuso. Akuso, which means I will hear. I will hear. All right, let's look at the next word. Baptizo. Baptizo. Notice that zeta gives you the DZ sound, we said, unless it starts the beginning of a word, but in the middle of the word or near the end, it's baptizo, the DZ sound, and that means I baptize. I baptize. Now the word baptizo is the future form, and it means I will baptize. I will baptize. Now the stem is baptid, and that's just telling you that sometimes they don't always conform to the regular way of writing them, that their stem is a little bit different than maybe you would actually see it in the present active indicative, and that's the stem. The actual stem has a delta on the end of it, but when words and letters, that is, combined, sometimes letters end up transforming into other things. They combine and they make one sound, and so you just have to kind of be aware of some of those things. But notice the English word at the bottom right hand of your screen. That is a transliterated form of the word baptism. Baptism. Now, let me spend just a second talking about that word, because when we spoke about transliteration earlier in some of our lessons, we'd mentioned that transliteration is taking the Greek word letter by letter and finding a corresponding English sound or an English letter that corresponds to that Greek sound. Now, when some of the translators, early translators, began to translate the Greek into English, they found this word, baptizo, or baptisma for the noun form, which means baptism, and they decided that we didn't have an English word that they liked that fit well that concept, so they transliterated that word into the form that we see it today and sort of made up a new word, as it were. And the word baptism really has reference to immersion. Immersion, to immerse something, or to dip, or to plunge, is the way a lot of lexicons define it. And so the general word for baptism then was just a transliterated form of that word baptid, or for the stem of that. And that's what we mean by transliteration again. All right, let's go back to the next word on the screen. Blepo. Blepo. Remember, we learned that one the other day. Blepo, which means I see. And then blepso. Blepso is I will see. I will see. Okay, let's take a look at the next word. The next word is grapho. Grapho. Which means I write. I write. And of course, graphics, or anything to do with that word graph, you see it attached to a lot of words, and you'll notice that that means that it has reference to writing. Gropso. Gropso is the future form of that, and it means I will write. I will write. Okay? And by the way, just something that you may find interesting is the word for voice is phone, and when people spoke about phonograph machines years ago, they used that word. They made up that word out of these Greek words to identify what they were doing, and that they were literally writing sound. It was a writing of sound, a phonograph, or a photograph comes from two Greek words, photos, or phos meaning light, and then graph meaning write. So a photograph is literally a writing with light, because when you open up the camera lens and when you take a picture and you push that button and the shutter opens up, light writes that image on the emulsion of that film, and thus you have a picture. And so it's a writing of light, a photograph. Okay, so maybe that'll help you a little bit as you think about some of these words. Let's take a look at the next word now. The next word is didasko. Didasko. Didasko means I teach, and our English word didactic comes from that word. And sometimes people talk about the Apostle Paul's didactic discourse, or his instructional discourse, and maybe some of the letters that he had. You'll see that in some of the commentaries. But the future form is didasko. Didasko. Okay? And that means I will teach. I will teach. And actually, that should be didaxo. Didaxo. I was looking at the present form there, but the future form is didaxo. Didaxo. I will teach. All right, let's take a look at the next word. Doxadzo. Doxadzo. That word means I glorify. I glorify. The future form of that word is pronounced doxaso. Doxaso, which means I will glorify. Okay, again, let's go back to the top of that one. The present form is doxazo, doxazo, but the future form is doxaso. Okay, notice the difference. Doxaso. Now, the English word doxology comes from this word. In fact, the word logos is even at the end of that word doxology, which means to say or word. So you're saying a word of praise when you hear someone speak about doxology. They're talking about a word of praise. All right, let's go to the next word. The next word is etoimazo. Etoimazo. And that means I prepare. I prepare. Etoimaso. Etoimaso. I prepare, or I will prepare. Now, let's take a break for just a moment, and I want to share something with you that you might find a little bit humorous. I think that when you're working through these words, anything you can do to sort of reinforce the meaning of that word is going to be helpful to you. For example, if you can find something that reminds you of that word in the word itself that maybe sounds something like English, even though it may have nothing to do with it per se, but yet you can come up with some sort of memory device, then that'll help you and it'll get it into your mind so the next time you see that word, it just comes right off your lips. You don't even have to think about the memory device. But sometimes we just need a way to sort of key us into what that word means. And if we go back and take a look at that word again now, you will see that mazo at the end of etoimazo sounds a little bit like, if you use your imagination, like matzo. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with matzos or not, but here in the United States, matzos is a brand of unleavened bread. It's a brand that is on the outside of the box of a lot of the unleavened bread that we use in our communion services. Kind of interesting that word has even a Hebrew origin to it. But anyway, it sounds a little bit like matzos. And helping me to remember this word, because etoimazo doesn't have a transliterated form in English that I'm aware of, and so nothing to really hang your hat on, as it were, or to really drive a peg in and say, okay, now I've got a memory device. But so you have to sort of play some games sometimes, and here's a little game I like to play. But the word matzo, again, has reference to this unleavened bread. Well, what do every Sunday morning? We prepare the matzo. We prepare the matzo and get it ready for the communion service. And so maybe when you see that word etoimazo, you can think of preparing the matzos for the communion service. Well, that's just how I have done it on occasions and working with people, you know, and it may be different in another culture. You may find that there's a word in your culture that sounds a little bit like something in that stem that would have reference to preparing something. And so anything you can do to make those connections in your mind, I think, is perfectly acceptable. All right, let's take a look at the next word. The next word is echo. Echo, which means I have. And we've seen that word in this class before and previous classes. Echo, I have. Now notice the next word in your book will have the rough breathing mark, and it should be pronounced hexo. You have the C letter there. That's hexo. Hexo. All right, and that means I will have. I will have. And our word, English word hectic, comes from this word. All right, let's look at the next word. The next word is therapeuo. Therapeuo, which means I heal. The future form of that word is therapeuso. Therapeuso. That sigma again reminds you of the future tense. I will heal. I will heal. Okay? And again, these could be easily translated in the present tense as I am healing or I heal. I am healing or I heal. And our English word therapeutic comes from this Greek word. All right, let's take a look at the next word. The next word is Kerusso. Kerusso, which means I preached. Now here's one of those words you have to sort of watch out for, because that sigma, that stem, kerux, all right, actually when it goes to the present tense actually has a sigma in it, and you just have to remember that kerusso means I preach, but keruxo is the form I will preach. Keruxo, I will preach. And the word kerygma, as it's used sometimes to refer to what some people call the core gospel, or the basic story of the death, burial, and the resurrection of Christ, is sometimes identified as the kerygma, and some people make a distinction between the kerygma and the didache, but the Bible really makes no distinction in regard to that at all. Those terms really should be used interchangeably. But at any rate, remember that some of these words do have some funny things about them. And you say, well, that's hard, that's difficult, and why does Greek do that? Well, I think if you'll take a look at your own language, in this instance, our English language, you'll take a close look at that and you'll see that there are all kinds of oddities to our language, and we just use them. We just learn the irregular parts of them. We learn the things that are a little bit unusual, and you'll get used to it. It's just a matter of putting them into your mind. All right, let's take a look at the next word. The next word is one that we have seen readily, haven't we? Luo. Luo, which means I loose. I loose. The future form of that word is luso. Luso, which means I will loose. I will loose. Okay, and our word analysis comes from that word. Now let's take a look at the next word. Patho. Patho. I trust in. The future form is peso. I will trust in. I will trust in. And our word fidelity comes from that word. Let me give you perhaps another little memory device here to have a little fun with this. Remember I said maybe think of something that sounds like this word, and we just looked at the word, the future form, peso. Peso. Well, that sounds a whole lot like the currency that's used in Mexico. In the U.S. we use dollars, and in the other countries they use a different form of currency, and all of them have their names. Well, in Mexico they use pesos. So maybe think about a man that owes you money, and you're in Mexico, and you say, well, I just trust that he's going to pay me the pesos that he owes me. And so some little device like that may help, embed that vocabulary word and its meaning in your mind. All right, let's take a look at the next word. The next word is pimpo. Pimpo, which means I sinned. I sinned. And its future form is pimpso. Pimpso, I will send. I will send. And the English word pomp comes from that. All right, let's look at the next word. Pistuo. Pistuo is the verb form of faith or believe, and here it means I believe. I believe. We'll see the noun form of that word in the third declension nouns quite a bit later on in our series of lessons. But I believe, pistuo. Then its verb form, or rather its future form, is pistuso. Pistuso. And it means I will believe. I will believe. All right. And as you can see on the screen there, that actually patho is very similar to this. And that patho means I trust in, or I trust. And so faith and trust are closely linked together there. All right, let's look at the next word. The next word is sozo. Remember the DZ sound for zeta? Sozo. I save. Sozo. And the future form is so-so. So-so. I will save. I will save. All right, let's take a look at this next word. It's a me verb, and I'm going to explain more about what that means a little later on. But for now, just know that a me A-me is how you pronounce that. Notice the diphthong, epsilon, iota, and then you have mu, and then the iota, A-me. That means I am. I am. And it means also, if you will follow it out in the third person, is, and we'll talk more about that a little later on in the lesson, but I'm going to share something with you about A-me. A-me is a form that sometimes is coupled with the Greek word ego, which is the pronoun I. And sometimes, particularly in John's gospel account with reference to Jesus, he records a lot of the sayings that say that in English are translated I am, but in Greek it is ego eimi. And so it's like saying I am, and those two things are put together for emphasis. So when you see I am in English, when Jesus says I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the good shepherd, I am the light of the world, I am the resurrection, all of those have that word eimi, but they also have preceding it the pronoun ego. And so if you read it literally in English, it would say I am. But that's not the way it was intended, but rather that's the way the Greek New Testament uses emphasis. And so what Jesus was saying, in effect, is not just I am the way, the truth, and the life, but he's saying I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection. In other words, he and he alone, exclusively. So eimi means I am. All right, let's take a look at the next word. May. May is an adverb, and basically it's the negation of something. It just means not. A lot of times you'll see may before a verb, but only in the other moods other than the indicative. But when we get to the indicative mood, as you'll see now, with regard to oo, that also means not. That's the word that's used in the indicative mood preceding words to negate something, meaning something is not the case. So just pay attention to that, and we'll talk more about that a little later on in the lesson about some specifics on that. Okay, well that completes the vocabulary section of this particular chapter. Now let's go back to the very beginning of the chapter and highlight some important points that I want you to pay close attention to. So let's begin now with conjugation. Now if you'll look in your textbook on page 16, you'll notice at the very top of that page there is a short definition of conjugation. I want to call your attention to that definition, and then I'm going to explain it a little more in detail on the board, because the first time I took my Greek class, there were a lot of things that were just assumed. And when they started talking about the omega conjugation and the me conjugation, they just pretended as though I knew what they were talking about. So let's see if we can sort of explain that and maybe make it a little bit easier for all of us to understand. Notice first of all the definition in your book. He says that conjugation are basically related patterns of verbs that are known then as conjugation. And it comes from a Latin word that means I join together. I join together. He says the entire Greek verb system may be divided into two basic conjugations. And then he goes on to talk about that, the omega conjugation and the me conjugation. I want to go to the board now and explain to you a little bit further about what we mean by this, and perhaps make it a little easier to understand. All right, now let's notice, if we take a look at the board here, I have divided this board into two major sections, the omega conjugation and the me conjugation. Remember that conjugation means a coming together. If you were to look at all of the Greek verbs and look at their lexical form, and remember lexical form means present, active, indicative, first person, singular. And we looked at all of their lexical forms, and that those stems and that first person ending, you would see that all of those verbs could be sorted into two groups. If we went through the pile and we just took them one by one, if we put a piece of paper, got a piece of paper and put the word on there, and then piled them all up in a big pile and then started separating them out by how they looked, the endings, how their endings looked, we could sort them into two groups. We would find that there would be a whole bunch of verbs whose present, active, indicative stem ends in an omega. Look at these words here. Ago, okay, ends in the omega. Akuo ends in the omega. Blepo ends in the omega. Echo ends in the omega. Okay? So that would be one group. That would be one group. Now let's say that as we were sorting through them, we began to find some verbs that ended not in an omega, but ended in a me, or that is in the letters mu and iota. In other words, they're going to look like this. Take a look at this group of words here. This word apalumi, deiknumi, dunami, apadidomi, and phemi. All of these verbs end with the me sound, or these letters mu, iota. Now, these are verbs, and didomi here, for example, means I give, I give. So the lexical form for the present active indicative is me. That's the ending there. I. So all of these mean I. For example, apalumi means I destroy, I destroy. Deiknumi means I show, I show. Dunomi means I am able, I am able. Apadidomi means I give back, I give back. And phemi means I say, I say. So you can see here's one group of verbs that end with me, and then if we go back over now to look at these other verbs, we'll see that these verbs end in omega. All right? Now, you say, well, two groups. How do I know what their endings are and so forth? Well, you just have to commit them to memory. And the wonderful thing about this is that the omega conjugation is the one that we're going to primarily focus upon, because the vast majority of verbs that we will study will fall under this section here of the omega conjugation. Now, if you do find a verb with me endings, and you need to know these and look at them, because you're going to run across them in reading Greek, you'll notice that they form their endings just a little bit differently, don't they? So if you looked at this, didomi means I give. What do you think this one's going to be? This one's going to be our second person, which means you give. Now, this pattern is the order that we have here. If we can go back over and look at the omega conjugation, and we're familiar with this, we're going to talk more about it today. Luo means I loose. Lues means you loose. Lue means he, she, or it looses, or is loosing. So first person, second person, third person, these are the singulars. Then first person plural is luamen, we loose. Luete, you loose. Third person plural, luusen, they loose. Okay, so first person, second person, third person singulars. First person, second person, third person plurals. All right. Now, if we go over to the me conjugation, we're going to notice that they have a different way of forming their endings, all right, to tell us person. But if you really start looking at them, they're pretty similar. This one's a little bit different, okay, and this one right here. But this amen, we know that one. We give. All right, didate, it's very similar to the one we looked at over here. If you come back over here, look, te, all they did was left out this epsilon, which is really called the variable vowel that goes in here. And then if you go back here, leusen, all right, didaus, it almost looks the same, didasen. So this would be third person, they give, they give. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the omega conjugation. In other words, stems that come together with the omega. And then when we talk about the me conjugation, let's go over here and look at the me conjugation. We're talking about stems whose present indicative forms, first person, end with this me. They come together. So we're going to group these in one way, and their endings are going to look one way for determining tense and person and so forth. And then we're going to look at these groups over here, and their endings are formed in another way. This is the omega conjugation. Now, in the back of your book, and I want to show something to you at this point. In the back of your book, there is a chart that can be unfolded. And on that chart is listed all of the endings for luo, and you'll see omega conjugation across the top and me conjugation across the bottom, and it'll show you the various endings and how that's all laid out. It's sort of everything you need to know right here in regard to the omega and the me conjugations, of course, in regard to verbs. So that should be in the back of the David Allen Black text that we've been using for this course. But I just wanted to familiarize you a little bit with that, the omega and the me conjugation. We're going to be primarily concerned with the omega conjugation because it's the larger of the two. There are more verbs there, and you'll see those more often than you will the me, although you do need to be familiar with that and understand what we're talking about. Okay, well, that has to do with conjugation. Let's go now to the next section of this course, the primary active suffixes. Now, a suffix is a set of letters that is added on at the end of a word. A prefix are letters that are added on at the beginning of a word or of the stem or the root. So what we want to talk about are the primary active suffixes. In other words, those endings that you put on the end of a word or the end of a stem that allow you to know that that verb should be translated in the active voice. The active voice has reference to the subject of the sentence performing the action of the verb. Now, as we talk about those suffixes, one of the things that's nice to know is that once we learn a set of endings, you'll see them in other tenses in maybe a little variation of a form or so, but by and large, you're going to see them in other tenses besides just in the present tense. And as we begin to talk about that, I want to explain something to you in regard to tense. Let's go to the board and take a look at what I mean. Remember that a verb has tense, and with regard to tense, we're talking about the time element involved in the verb, as well as the aspect, the kind of action. In other words, when did the action of that verb take place? Was it in the past? Was it in the present? Or is it in the future? And the aspect of it is the kind of action. Now, remember we said there are several tenses in Greek. And those tenses can be divided up, according to Mr. Black and others, into two major categories. Well, we can see that there are primary tenses, and under primary tenses, we have the present tense, the future tense, the perfect tense, and the future perfect. Under the secondary tenses, you can see that we have the imperfect tense, the aorist tense, and the pluperfect tense. Now, you don't need to remember necessarily which tenses are primary and which ones are secondary. Don't worry about that. I'm just trying to explain a little bit better about what was written in the book and to help you to see that we're going to see some of these suffix endings in more than just one tense. All right? So if we go back to the primary tenses now, the present, the future, the perfect, and the future perfect, we're going to see that their endings basically are the same, or there may be some slight variation, but o, eis, a, amen, ete, usen are all important endings that you need to commit to memory that have reference to the first person, second person, third person singular, first person, second person, third person plural. All right, so the present, the future, the perfect, and the future perfect are going to share some of these endings in the active voice. All right, so what I want you to do is to see these clearly now on our screen. And notice there they are, the primary active suffixes. They are o, eis, a, amen, ete, usen. And what you need to remember are those endings. And in just a second, I'm going to show you on the board exactly what those mean. We've been talking about them already, but I want to reinforce it to you. But look at it carefully and say it with me. O, eis. We're going to go down on the left-hand side now, down on the first column. A, and then back up to the second column. Amen, ete, usen. Now, notice in that usen, there is a nu in parentheses. And don't worry about what that means right now. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. Sometimes it will be there, sometimes it won't be there, depending upon the letter that follows, the first letter of the following word. But right now, if you'll just learn o, eis, a, amen ete usen. And just say it. You can almost make it like a sort of song. O-ace-a, amen ete usen. O-ace-a, amen ete usen. O-ace-a, amen ete usen. And just sort of commit that to memory. O-ace-a, amen ete usen. All right, now what I want to do is take you back to the board and show you those endings and what they mean. You need to commit this to memory. Very, very important, okay? Notice that we have O, ace, a, amen, ete, usen. And what these are the first, second, and third person singular and plural endings for our active suffix endings for the primary tenses. So that O means I, it's first person singular. Ace means you, that's second person singular. Okay? A means he, she, or it, depending upon the context. All right, we'll translate it he if the subject of that sentence is a he, if it's a she, or if it happens to be a neuter subject, a neuter noun. We'll explain that later. But A means he, or she, or it, and that's the third person singular. Okay? All right. Amen is the first person plural, and it means we. Ete is the second person plural, and it means you. Usen is the third person plural, and it means they. So what you could do is you could memorize this chart with the Greek letters, okay, just by themselves, or without the Greek letters. In other words, this sort of paradigm here that we're looking at, the way this is arranged, is something that we're going to see again in the future. In other words, we'll see first, second, third person singular and plural in regard to other voices and other tenses. So this arrangement is something you need to get used to seeing and being aware of. But for right now, oase, amen ete usen are the primary suffix endings. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more as we move on through this lesson about the present and future active indicative of luo. I want you to see those on the board at this time. All right, now let's notice here on the board that I have the paradigm, as it's called, this arrangement of verb endings for the present active, and over here for the future active. We've learned our present active endings, o, ace, a, amen, ete, usen. Okay. Now what happens if we want to express to someone that this loosing is going on in the future? Let's imagine that you're the writer, all right, and that you're telling a story, and you're writing it in the present tense with active voice, and you're saying, now, I loosed a slave, and a little later on you say, well, you are in the process of loosing this man, or you loosed this man, and maybe you're talking about the dialogue that's going on in the story or whatever, but then maybe you wanted in the next chapter to refer to the fact that you're going to loose even more slaves. And so in this next chapter, if you're writing this in Greek, how would you do it? Well, you would insert that sigma sound, or that S sound that we've talked about, and on luo it fits very nicely. Let's look at it here now. We're just going to put the sigma right in front of our endings. See, our endings are still here. O, ace, a, amen, ete, usen. All we've done is inserted a sigma between our stem and our ending, our personal pronoun endings. So this is luso, which means I loose. Loose, you loose. Loose, he, she, or it looses. Loosamen, we will loose. And I should have been saying will all the time there, but loosete, you will loose. Loosusen, they will loose. So these are all future. So simply the active endings are the same for both the future and the present, but in the future all we've done is just simply add in this sigma, this S sound. And in the next lesson we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when you have a stem of a verb whose stem ends with a sigma already. What happens? What sound does it then make? And we talked a little bit about that in the vocabulary. So we're going to go ahead at this time and bring this session to a close. And we want you to go back and sort of maybe review some of the things that we've said in the textbook. And then when we come back in the next session, we'll finish out Chapter 3 as we begin to talk about some of the peculiar things about when letters come together and what happens. We'll talk about the use of mu or of u and may for the negative. We'll also talk about in the next chapter or in the next lesson a little bit about the verb eimi. And then at the end of that session, we're going to get to translate some words and partial sentences. It won't be a full sentence because we don't have nouns yet, but we'll do some translating, go through those exercises, and work through them together so that maybe you can begin to put all of this together in a session that will make hopefully a lot more sense to you. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate so much your being with us. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next lesson.